Welcome to a special debate format episode of the Anti-Empire Project. I'm the special moderator, Nora Barrows-Freidman from The Brief, tracking the empire and also the electronic intifada. Listeners who also read the newsletter might have seen an essay about Brazil, sub-imperialism, and multipolarity. In the essay, Justin Podur, one of our debaters, assumed that the global economy is in the process of changing from a unipolar world of US and Western hegemony to a multipolar one where there are several large, powerful countries and where small and medium-sized countries might have a bit more room to maneuver. After reading the essay, Sam Gindin, our other debater, questioned whether such a transition is even happening. So in today's episode, we debate the following proposition. The global economy is in transition from a unipolar US-dominated world to a multipolar one where China, Russia, and possibly other powers are on the rise and US power is in decline. Debating for the proposition is Justin, host of this podcast. Justin has 20 minutes for his opening statement. Justin, I'm tossing it to you. Good luck.
All right, here I go. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thank you, Sam, for joining us. Thank you, Nora, for moderating. We will be worthy of the Oxford Union and the other great debating societies of our age, maybe even of the Second International. We can scream at each other like Lenin and his interlocutors did, or Marx and Bakunin or something. That was the first. Okay, so until the 1600s or 1700s, 25% of the world economy was China, 25% of the world economy was India. It was over the course of British imperialism that India was reduced to something like 3 or 4%, and China was also came very close to being dismembered at the end of the 19th century. Speaking of dismembering, the wealth that came from dismembering and dismantling the civilizations of the Americas, the Aztecs, the Mayas, the Incas, taking their land, enslaving their populations, the African slave trade, which Britain monopolized from 1707 on. These are the bases for the accrued advantages that were kind of piled upon one another by the British Empire and then its US successor. So it's a kind of a plundered wealth that is globally unprecedented that led to the rise of the British Empire, and that was followed by the rise of the US Empire. And the Industrial Revolution, the way I see it, is something that happened because of that plunder, not the other way around. So that's one element of my worldview here, which is that, you know, I think a lot of people see the Industrial Revolution as becoming this like technological, this incredible technological monster that then went and took over the world. But in fact, it was taking over the world that led to all of the massive wealth that was then used to form the basis of the Industrial Revolution. So the wealth we're talking about was drained from the colonies. It's been quantified in the case of India at around $45 trillion by the Patnaiks. The concepts mentioned in the essay that we're talking about Brazil and multipolarity, I talk about two processes: value transfer and unequal exchange. And both of these concepts involve a series of processes by which the goods, the exports, the things that are produced by and in the global south are kept low. The prices of those are kept low. The prices of global north goods and services, especially, are kept high. The mechanisms of this are outlined in many studies. I always mention they had a big influence on me and my thinking. Recent ones, Zach Cope's The Wealth of Some Nations, Patnaik and Patnaik's Theory of Imperialism, Jason Hickel's academic papers about unequal exchange in the ecological sense and ecological value transfer. And of course, Michael Hudson, Global Fracture, Killing the Host, and Sub-Imperialism. So what are these mechanisms through which the wealth is drained? There is always, in recent decades, the US always acts to prevent resource producers from forming effective cartels, right? So, the use of the alliance with Saudi Arabia to break OPEC, the use of subsidized agriculture, but also of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization to enforce intellectual property, to attack food security, to attack the ability of countries to produce their own food. There's also mechanisms like brain drain, right? To make sure that educated people migrate to the global north and that the expensive services that they charge are not available cheaply in their own countries because the professionals are all gone. Of course, I mentioned patents, intellectual property regimes. There's also the sale of weapons, weapons that are not appropriate to the self-defense needs of countries, but they buy them to provide the money back or send the money to the US. Arms sales are a part of the transfer of value to the countries that produce arms, which are also the same Western countries and notably the US. There are experts that go and restructure your country and advise governments on how to cut public sector, smash unions, concentrate land, deploy the police, control media, install democracy, etc. And finally, in the final analysis, there's the threat of war, there's the threat of coups, there's the threat of sanctions, all of which deter any nationalist governments from trying the economic nationalist route. The crown jewel, the top of this whole pyramid, is the dollar seigniorage, right? So the fact that it's all of this power pyramid is the base, and at the very top of it is the ability of the US that the US has had to impose the dollar. So the transactions of the world's between countries that have nothing to do with the US, they take place in dollars. Treasuries of central banks hold their reserves in dollars, so the US can add more dollars anytime they want, where others have to earn them through export. There are those who argued, like the Indian Research Unit on Political Economy, that argued that this was one of the main causes of the US invading Iraq in 2003, when Saddam Hussein switched to trading oil in euros, when Libya proposed a gold-backed currency for Africa just before Gaddafi was overthrown, and the constant pressure on people like Chavez or Correa, or those movements in Ecuador and Venezuela who are punished, the level of freak out, so to speak, when they start talking about changing the currency basis goes haywire when we reach that discussion. So the question is, what happens when these mechanisms are no longer available? And that's what takes me to the reason I argue in favor of this proposition, because I believe that this whole pyramid of value transfer is less and less solid. It's on a less solid foundation, and it's being attacked in all of its details. So China is now ahead of the US in purchasing power parity. It's ahead in terms of the volume of manufacturing. Technologically, China is close. Each time the US bans some kind of chip or some kind of technology, you see Chinese scientists, engineers rolling up their sleeves and figuring out how to do it. And so as these things are sanctioned, we see China just making up for it in some other way. And so the ability to just cut China out of an industry or out of the global economy, I don't think is there anymore. As far as what about choking off China's resources? Well, China is developing independent relationships with countries in Africa, in the Arab world, even with allies that are supposed to be absolutely solid, like Saudi Arabia. So you can't the US is not able to monopolize resources like they did, and they're not able to monopolize technology like they did. They can't even count on the loyalty of the Saudi Arabias of the world. And then there's the military side. Of course, all of the power of the dollar is based on a basis of military supremacy. Now, this is debatable. For sure, but I believe that Ukraine is showing that the US can't just impose its will if Russia disagrees. I believe Syria showed that before Ukraine. And even where Russia wasn't involved, like Afghanistan, the US withdrew, basically, in part because Pakistan didn't allow them to continue to use their bases to attack Afghanistan. And once that was over, became very difficult to control Afghanistan if you don't have Iran or Pakistan. They're working on getting Pakistan back, but again, things are not going according to plan there either. Even Iraq, the consequences of the Iraq War, I don't think have been fully digested in terms of the damage that was done to the US ability to project power. Now, under the bipolar world, where the USSR existed, the US offered aid programs, human rights, growth ideology. These were the alternatives that were offered to things like land reform, communism, economic nationalism. And today, the offer that the US makes is much less. It's like, we won't bomb you, we won't sanction you, we won't overthrow you. And all of those things have less bite because they've been overused. So they've sanctioned so many countries, Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, China, Russia, that they start to trade with each other. Iran has kind of thumbed its nose at US sanctions on Venezuela. They've exchanged technology, they've made armed escorts to oil shipments and all kinds of things like this that are would be considered fairly provocative if the US could simply impose whatever it wanted. Meanwhile, in the West, there's a continuous rollback of social democratic distribution, various attempts to pump the dollars as these mechanisms of actually draining resources are being strained or severed. If I'm right and the global South wages and prices can't continuously be depressed, then we are going to see major changes ahead. If the global South can break the monopoly of buyers of their resources, which is happening through China and Africa, and the growing coalition of the sanctioned, then we are going to see big changes. We are on the verge or in the middle of some big changes in terms of the world system. So what does this mean in terms of like the long view? Like I said, I view the Anglo-American empire as kind of one system. They took over from the Spanish, empire before sometime in the 1700s. It's been a good run, 250 plus years, but I do believe it's coming to an end. I believe that the imperialist theorists of the 20th century, like Mahan and Mackinder, they developed a whole geographical scheme of how naval powers like Britain and the US could keep the global heartland, right? The Europe and Asia together, the world island, they called it. They had to keep them down by controlling the coasts because they feared the possibilities of the heartland uniting, the Russia-Germany alliance, which US is currently trying to do their best to prevent, I think successfully, at least in the short and medium term, but also like China, Russia, which has been driven together by the same action. China, India, the Arab world, and Africa were all underrated, I would say, by these naval theorists. The Sino-Soviet split of the 50s to recently held this back, the world heartland unity, but that's basically been overcome. Once that's overcome, there's very little the US can do. If they fall apart again, maybe we'll be back into the kind of conversation about how the US can insert themselves. So, the imperialists of the early 20th century believed basically in a racial theory, right? They believed that if the white race held their solidarity, they could keep the rest of the world down forever. But like that whole theory was always based on an admission that there's nothing that special about Europe or about the US. Like you have technology that can eventually make its way around the world. the kind of takeover, the theft of the Americas happened mainly because of smallpox and other diseases that destroyed huge numbers of indigenous populations. Without that, I also don't think we would see the kind of settler colonies that we've seen. And so the only thing left, I think, to rebut is the idea that maybe the U.S. and China are kind of in cahoots, and all the tension that we're seeing is kind of made for our consumption, made for the consumption of, foolish people, whereas the transnational kind of ruling class is still working together and coordinating together. But I don't believe that, because for that to be true, that means basically a lot of things that are happening are fake, right? The kidnapping of Meng Wanzhou, the persecution of Chinese scientists, the US stunts in Taiwan and the South China Sea, the US failure in Syria, the US never apparently, the US maybe wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan. They never wanted to invade Iran. They never wanted to subjugate North Korea. So all these things that doesn't want to defeat Russia. So all these things that the US has been unable to do, we would have to maybe believe that they never really wanted to do them. And I think that if we look at their statements and their public behaviors and what they've tried to do, I think they have tried to do them and they can't do them anymore. And that's why I believe we are in a transition from a unipolar to a multipolar world. Thank you very much. I now turn it over to you, Nora, to turn it over to my debate partner.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Justin. Sam is debating now against the proposition that, quote, the global economy is in transition from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. Sam Gindin is an economist, a labor activist, and a writer. Sam, you have about 20 minutes as well, even though Justin came in just under 17. So you can get his 3 minutes.
You can go to 23.
There you go.
Okay.
Good luck,
Thanks.
Sam.
Yeah. I love the way you started, Justin. You look like you're really ready to do jujitsu. I'm not sure where to start. I mean, I think our differences, there are so many things you got into, which I partly agree to and mostly didn't. And I don't know how to get at it. I'm going to approach it. I think the way I'm going to start is with a different way of thinking about the American empire. And I'm going to try to present a different, which will give you some ammunition in terms of attacking it. And I guess I want to say two things to think about this as we move through it. One is the American empire was never an omnipotent. And I want to kind of go through a little history of the American empire in terms of making that. And the second point is when we're thinking about transitions that are going on, we have to think about the contradictions in China as well. We think about the contradictions in the US, we have to think about the contradictions in China. I will say, after listening to you, it's hard for me to imagine people coming to some conclusion without getting into so many detailed things. So I see this as kind of, having listened to you, I see this as a longer term ongoing debate that needs to take place. And I guess I don't know whether there's a transition or not. Most of all, I'm skeptical about whether we can actually say there's a transition. Empirically, who knows? I don't see my role as kind of predicting where things are going to be in 10 years, but I'll talk about that later. So let me just start off with the American Empire. The American Empire wasn't just an extension of the British Empire, of another, there's a new kid on the block and it happens to be the Americans. It was the British before. Something radical happened in the nature of empire. The US was the most powerful economic country by the end of the 20s, but it wasn't trying to form an empire. It had its empire in Latin America, but was mostly trying to open up the other empires so it could get into their sphere of control. Through the war, the conclusion they came to was that global capitalism was really in danger because of these conflicts within capitalism. I mean, if you look at the first half century, the first half of that 20th century, it looked like not just globalization wasn't possible, you had two world wars, a depression, but maybe capitalism wasn't possible. And what they came out of this with was a different conception of empire. It was a sense of empire being a universal system for all of capitalism. What they tried, it became a system. They moved away from saying empires used to be about territory and controlling certain territories and keeping other capitals out because you're competing with them. Now what they were saying was, we want to imagine a world where you're not divided into empires that keep out other capitals. How do we get there? They wanted to say actually that where empires limited sovereignty, we believe in sovereign states. Qualifications, of course, which I'll get to. But the idea was that there would be sovereign states, Germany, France, Japan, etc., even the losers of the war. Third of all, that each state would take responsibility within their own borders for the making of global accumulation. Canada, for example, would set the conditions for General Motors to come in, exploit the workers, get subsidies, have a market, etc., and not be discriminatory. In other words, each state couldn't just favor their own capital. It was for global accumulation. They had to be thinking in terms of global accumulation, following those rules. And everybody had to accept the rule of law, which was defined in a very particular way. Property relations, private property relations were sacrosanct. Free trade had to take place. Free capital movements had to take place. And profits had to be free to make their profits wherever they were and reinvest them anywhere else. So the rule of law was critical. Now, where the military fit into this was different than the past. The military wasn't just there to take over, for example, Iraq and say, now this is ours. The military was there to try to protect this global capitalism where it existed and was being threatened by a revolution, nationalist or socialist, or to spread capitalism. And that was a major point. The military was there to create the conditions in other countries for this kind of global, universal, global capitalism. And it started after the war by trying to break down the empires that existed, which was contradictory. They didn't want to break them down to the point that communists took over, for example. And then to spread this to the global south, to spread capitalism to the global south. So in a way, I'm really emphasizing capitalism a lot more, and I'm going to emphasize class a lot more as well as we get into this. The problem of getting it into the global south was much harder because the institutions didn't exist. You know, in Germany and France and England, you could say, well, the institutions had been developed for capitalism. There were markets, there were certain kinds of states. The challenge was to restore capitalist power after the war, because a lot of capitalist power had been threatened and delegitimated. So it was a different kind of problem. That was the challenge in the West, very much. The fear wasn't Russia and the Soviet Union. The fear was communist movements within France and Germany and Italy. And the question is, how do you restore capitalism in those countries? How do you deal with radical labor movements and channel their militancy into consumerism rather than into democratizing investment? So it was this problem of integration. They were quite successful in integrating Europe and Japan. To develop the countries that lost the war, they were integrated, but the former developed capitalist countries were integrated quite successfully. The global south was very uneven, and I stress uneven. In some cases, they actually became major manufacturers. We used to define the global south as they don't do manufacturing, they just ship resources. Well, the reality is that there's more manufacturing in the global south. Part of that is China, but not just China, than there is in the north. The global south actually developed in particular ways through the system, some of them very unevenly. Asia developed, very fast. The question of whether, Latin America was, starts and declines. Africa still is a questionable thing. So there was this, what imperialism meant was the making of a global capitalism and the difficulties in doing that. It was successful in terms of the Eastern Europe and Russia and the Soviet Union falling, Vietnam falling, limiting Cuba in Latin America, but it's an ongoing thing. So I want to say some things about the limits along the way. because this is an incredibly ambitious and difficult thing to make a global capitalism where everybody can compete according to rules. You don't compete by saying, I'm going to shoot you, I'm going to bomb you generally. They're saying we're going to compete by having rules that we all accept, international rules and also rules in each country. So, if you looked at 1950, US had something like half the manufacturing under capitalism. By 1973, they had about 25%. Is this decline? No, because the only way you were going to build a global capitalism was that other capitalists were going to share in it. The measure was, were they integrating global capitalism in a way that American corporations could also benefit from? So it wasn't happening in the United States. Manufacturing wasn't taking over all the manufacturing, but these global American corporations were in Europe, pushing for European integration, actually. So the integration of Europe to make Europe more successful in competing with the United States was very much supported by the United States. They saw this as adding more stability to capitalism. And it was American corporations in Europe who they were the most internationalized. So they loved the integration of Europe. In the mid-50s, you get the Bandung countries. You get this rebellion from countries that had moved towards some degree of autonomy. There were national liberation movements, and were now getting together, particularly African and Asian countries, and challenging all the inequalities, whatever their reason was. I wouldn't argue at all with you about the inequalities that existed. This is capitalism. There's inequalities within a country, there's regional inequalities, and there are very profound inequalities across countries. But they were trying to resist this. And by the 60s, they were getting actually quite radical. The resolutions they were passing were about things like nationalization. The sovereign right of countries to nationalize private property. So they were getting quite radical, but it didn't go anywhere. It didn't go anywhere because they didn't have the internal strength and because so many of them were actually outward oriented. It was much easier to imagine saying, well, our wages are low. Why don't we export more? Isn't that the path to development? I mean, China does this in spades later, which we'll get to. But even for these countries, it was easy to say, how do we legitimate ourselves? We can borrow money. So they would borrow. It's much easier than restructuring and taking on your own internal classes. They borrow money and then you become dependent. You have to pay it back, so you have to export. So now you have to export. So that process, which was a radical challenge, which we shouldn't forget about, failed. It failed because of the seduction of a global capitalism that would allow you to grow faster. In the 70s crisis, the US had a profitability crisis. It had a crisis of the dollar. France was saying, we're going to take out our gold. We don't like where the US is going. It was spending all this money on military bases everywhere to consolidate capitalism in case it needed it. But Poulantzas had this great insight, which was that, yeah, the US is in crisis and a lot of people are mad at it, and Germany's complaining about things, France is complaining about things, but you know what? They all want the US to survive, because that was the other rule of this new empire. It needed an indispensable nation, somebody who had the capacity, both administratively, central banks, technologically, to keep this thing going. It couldn't just go spontaneously or some people meeting to keep it going. So even during that crisis, there was a concern that there was an openness to the fact that we want America to change so it can remain a responsible empire. So it comes through that crisis actually stronger. They got off of gold and the dollar became more important. They accelerated globalization, which actually meant they were starting to invest in the global south where there were opportunities. And it led to, either through supply chains or just investing in other countries, especially in Asia, to the development of these countries. They were being integrated through their own bourgeoisie, but also through workers who are looking for jobs, which kind of makes sense. Workers who want a job and are happy to see foreign direct investment come in. And by the way, all the rhetoric from these countries, from the politicians and the elites, was always to talk left. They spoke a nationalist language at the same time that they were calling for McDonald's or GM to come into their countries. That was kind of a standard approach to it. And then an interesting thing happens after the 70s crisis in terms of people who think in terms of inter-imperial rivalry. Capitalism's post-war boom had kind of ended, generally ended. unevenly, and the economies were slowing down, and there was a thought that we're going to see inter-imperial rivalry now. Europe's going to compete with the United States. Americans were already worried about Japan's growth. There was a lot of, you read the literature, incredible racist literature about Japan taking over. And then when that didn't work, there was Europe led by Germany. But what actually happened was there wasn't inter-imperial rivalry. There was more competition, but what emerged was neoliberalism. And what was so powerful about neoliberalism was it said it's a class question. What we all have to do is break the working class, have austerity, stop the growth in social services, and through that, there was a solution to all of that. That's how we would all restore our profits and continue to compete, rather than compete with each other at an imperial way that might break down globalization. The Asian crisis at the end of the 90s, again, there was a problem of, well, is integration good? This crisis was really profound. There are major crises in exchange rates. But what actually happened was that they concluded, almost every country that was involved in that, China exception, concluded that we actually have to accept more integration. We have to export more so that we have larger surpluses. So if there is a run on our currency, we'll have the surpluses to deal with it. And that meant more exports. And you saw that. Asia turned to a lot more manufacturing exports to the West. The last crisis we saw, I mean, the financial crisis, this was a major crisis. Started in the United States. It was global. It looked like maybe capitalism won't survive. And what they showed was, the Federal Reserve became the global central bank. A lot of the money that it was printing wasn't just for the United States. They were printing money for the European banks. They needed the European banks to survive, because otherwise everything's so integrated, there would be an economic collapse and maybe, a serious crisis of capitalism. So the Federal Reserve at that moment in time showed how important the US was. Now, I want to stress, when we talk about American decline, America's losing a lot of its light manufacturing all through the 70s. It's losing it to Japan. Some of it it's losing to India. It's losing it to Asia. And then it starts also being threatened in auto. Japan, Germany are building auto plants or sending exports. And the question, this is a crucial question. It isn't whether, how's my time? 5 minutes? Okay. It isn't a question of whether America is running into problems. It is always running into problems. It isn't a question of America can say we can reduce everything. It's part of being an empire is you have to accept that you're not going to be, the dominant exporter all the time. If you look from the late 70s to today, the US has run a deficit all the time. Part of that was stimulating the global economy, but you have to recognize that what it actually allowed, because of the US dollar, and everybody's bringing their dollars back to the United States, including China and Japan, is that the US can actually get these goods from the global South almost free. These extra goods they're paying for in dollars. I don't want to exaggerate in terms of almost free, but they're getting it, and you're essentially getting the value of labor abroad cheap. You don't have to make up for it with your own exports. Now, it meant a lot of job losses in the States. So you always have to ask, well, how did they adjust? That's a critical question, because the question of whether you can sustain an empire isn't whether you have a problem, it's whether you can get around it. So the US moved very significantly into high tech, computers, software, pharmacare, aerospace. These became the major industries, the high tech industries. They accepted that they were going to lose the other things, and that was going to be a real burden because you're going to have a lot of frustrations, which Trump took advantage of. They also moved into services, financial services, consultancy, engineering, accounting, legal. They moved into massive distribution centers because that's key to globalizations. You get the Walmarts, the Amazons. So you're seeing this shift in America in a way that when you look at decline, you miss the flip side of this. So you have to look at that. Okay, so I'm running out of time, but we're going to have another 10 minutes, so that's great. I guess what I would stress, because I haven't really gotten into China and the BRICS and Russia, which I'll get into the next moment. But when we think about this, that we think about, does the US have the capacity to adjust, which it has had in the past? Does it have advantages, which people used to think in the 50s that more military expenditures were keeping the economy afloat? I think that was wrong. You could do that through welfare, extending the welfare state, legitimating yourself. Where the military is so important is in high-tech production. That's why it's important. It's been a base of subsidizing high-tech production. It needs that high-tech production, and it reinforces it, in the US case, into commercialization. Now, this isn't automatic. I'm not saying that the US empire will be there forever. I'm saying that to underestimate it and to dismiss it, and especially the US empire is no longer legitimate. This is a big change. I agree with Justin on this. Internally, nobody thinks that capitalism is great. In the 60s, we used to tell people, you might be getting all these things, but there's more to life than having these consumer goods. And we'd have to convince them of this. Now, you don't have to convince them of anything. They all think that capitalism sucks. They generally don't think that there's an alternative. And I think internationally, we're seeing a similar thing. There's a lot of delegitimation of the American empire. And by the way, when you were listing their defeats, you can go back to Vietnam. I mean, the question was, so they lost in Vietnam, which a lot of Americans thought, if we lose in Vietnam, this is going to spread everywhere. It's going to expose our weakness. It didn't happen. One of the headlines in Time magazine a few years later, maybe a decade later, was about Vietnam. America lost the war. Wait, Vietnam won the war. Capitalism won the struggle, because Vietnam was integrated into capitalism by then. And it's not about American legitimacy and people not liking America, which they don't. It's whether there is any social force that can break this. And you're looking at whether China could do it. And I'm going to argue in my later session that there are contradictions in China as well. And one of the things we have to ask is, if there's going to be another pole, does it have to actually break with global capitalism? And if it has to break with global capitalism and America, then aren't we talking about socialism, and socialism coming from socialist movements in the States? Are we exaggerating how much weight we expect to carry in social transformations by depending on inter-imperialist rivalry or on China? And that's something we can get into. And I'd really like to get into the BRICS thing and the China thing. And I guess what I'm doing is, rather than directly attacking what you're saying, Justin, I'm giving some different takes and some different things to look at, which I think we all will have to sort out as we try to understand where are we going in the next 10, 15 years. Okay.
Thank you so much, Sam. And yes, we now are moving to the rebuttal phase of this debate. And Justin, I would love to hear your arguments in the context of China and BRICS, especially in Latin America. You have 10 minutes. Go for it.
Okay. So Sam, I as I listen to you, I'm reminded of your book with Leo Panitch about, a lot of these issues, the late Leo Panitch, good friend of yours and a colleague of mine at York. And what I see there is, or what I hear there is a kind of a whole theory of history, and with like different touch points, the Asian financial crisis and, the 1950s or the 70s crisis. And I have a different, I look at history differently, and I look at different touch points, and I see different things going on, and different kind of milestones. And here's what I mean. So you talked about how, the transition from the UK to the British Empire to the American was different. And it's true, it was different, but I would say that the British Empire had different phases as well. And the British Empire was, I argue, no less of a system that did incorporate Europe, that did incorporate developing the settler colonies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the US, Argentina. There were beneficiaries. Europe was developed through this system, the Sterling zone, the way that Keynes, right? Keynes wrote about this in his first book, Indian Currency and Finance, from 1913. Radhika Desai talks about this book. So the Patnaiks talk about this too, the circulation, the way that the wealth from India that was drained through all these clever mechanisms was then, the source of this surplus that was invested in primarily in Europe, again, to develop the West, right? And then, so the big event for me is, the World War One, of course. I mean, the world wars are big events, but for me, and like the way that the communists of that time understood, like Mao or Stalin or Lenin, they understood it as this process of revolution. You were talking about this, like, is capitalism viable, right? So you're talking about it like from the point of view of the capitalists in the West that are trying to, the whole narrative that you told struck me as like a narrative of like European capitalists, American capitalists, Japanese capitalists trying to figure out how to maintain their world domination. What's going on outside of that is, Indian independence in 47, Chinese revolution in 49, the Soviet Union in 1917, and then the decolonization of most of the world in the 60s, right? So that is the big story. And for me, the big question for the imperialists, which they never like to talk about, so they almost take it for granted, but for them, their obsession, their perpetual obsession, is actually, how do we keep the drain from the colonies, the former colonies, going? And that's why the neo-colonial, so the whole idea that these are sovereign states in different levels of dependence, different levels of development, I don't really see it that way. I see it as these are former colonies that are, the new US system is a system ensnaring them all into a neo-colonial situation, a neo-colonial dispensation from which they can continue to extract the surplus, which you talked about. Like I think we agree on that. Like, this is about getting free labor from, exchanging less for more, right? Exchanging less valuable for more valuable, so that you can continue to get these wonderful goods, resources, agricultural goods, and outright like manufacturing labor, service labor. Not all services in the US are high tech, right? A lot of the services are actually performed by insecure global South labor. And that's a big part of what they're doing. So, so now, I also agree that we shouldn't underestimate the US, and I'm aware of that danger. The stakes for me, the reason I'm so interested in this whole multipolarity debate, and the reason that I don't want to think, I think it's really important to not think that the only possibility for change is going to come from the US. And I think I've fallen into that trap for too long. And for me, it's like trying to get out of that headspace has been a big part of this for me. And so that's kind of like the stakes of it for me. So now, what does that mean for questions like, so you had this skepticism. Oh, one last point. You did say the real reason for the US massive military investment has to do with high tech manufacturing. I think that's a part of it, but I don't think that's the big part, the big reason for US military investment. I think the big reason for US military investment is fundamentally to maintain the threat of military force all over the world if any of the former colonies try to exit the neo-colonial dispensation. And that's what I think Russia has challenged now. I think that Russian military power has been an unpleasant surprise. But this is another thing with the whole way that we discussed the history, right? Because you talked about like the 70s to the 90s. You mentioned Vietnam, but the collapse of the Soviet Union was a big part of why the US was able to do all of the things that it did in the 90s, and why it's not going to be able to do that anymore. Russia was down and out for a couple of decades, and there's no reason to think that it's going to return to that. And when from 1917 until 1989, Russia, or 1992 or 3 or whatever, 91, Russia was always a constraint on Western power. Russia collapsed, and I think that led a lot of US neocons into this delusion that they could collapse anyone, anywhere, whenever they want. There's no reason to think Russia's going to collapse like that again. And likewise, China. China was a colony. China was playing a very dependent role in the global economy, even for the first few decades. But in recent decades, that's not the case anymore. China is more than happy to blow off US dictates whenever it doesn't suit them. And that also is driving US elites into a bit of a tizzy right now. And psychologically, they're having a hard time handling it. So that's why I don't think that China and Russia can be dismissed, because again, the historical pattern has always been that they haven't been just like integrated into the world system or the US-led system, except for a little while. There was a few decades, in China's case, from about the so-called century of humiliation, right? 1839 to 1949. In Russia's case, it was less than that. It was basically from 1990 till about 2008 or so. And so these powers are not going away, and that's going to have to, and they're not being integrated as subordinates in a US-led system. I don't think they see any reason why they should. And that leads to, so now BRICS, India, India's gone pretty fascist. It's been very sad for me to watch. India has been a pretty capricious ally to the West, right? They've played all kinds of games with Russian oil and joined various currency swap deals and things. They haven't been a great ally to the US. They do seem to want some level of independence. Brazil is always this question. Brazil was the reason that we wrote this essay. We have no idea what Brazil is going to do. I think for the most part, Brazil is going to have the hardest time coming out from under the thumb of the US as anybody, except maybe the Arab world, which again is continuously the victim, continuously being the target of US operations. And so that is, I guess those are my rebuttals. I guess the way to summarize my rebuttal is what I've heard from you is a kind of a discussion of why Europe and Japan accept US leadership. And I don't think that as the former colonies and the neo-colonies try to escape from this system, I don't think that they can be as easily contained or negotiated into the system as the Europe and Japan were, which were always part of the imperial in group.
All right, Justin Podur, and Sam, you have 10 minutes for your rebuttal.
Again, where to start? Very quickly, the US project was radically different than Britain. When Britain was building, when Britain had its empire, it didn't integrate Germany and Portugal. The whole African continent was divided up. We had a fragmented capitalism. Sections of it had a system in terms of their colonies, but it was fragmented. And what was unique about the American empire was the extent to which it could actually integrate them. That's really unique. When you talk about Japan and Germany, that's who they fought during the war. These were the enemies, and yet they get integrated after the war. In terms of the global South, I'm bothered by the extent to which everything is conspiratorial. sometimes this kind of exploitation was absolutely direct and gross. But one of the things about capitalism is that capitalism puts a voluntary cover to these things, in the same way that, a worker doesn't have to work for the boss, except the structures of capitalism make it necessary if he wants to survive. And then he gets exploited. Well, it's a similar thing with the global South. There are moments when it is direct, and repressive and use of the military, but there's also this question of the global South looking to develop through a relationship to global capitalism. And China is actually the best example of this. So I'll get to China in a second, but we have to appreciate that this is about struggles within each country about where they're going to go. And usually it is a class struggle, but it's a struggle within classes, landowners who aren't interested in globalization, budding manufacturers who are, they're fighting each other, but also workers who are stuck with, we're getting nowhere here. Can we get somewhere better if we integrate into capitalism? And that has happened. I mean, we have to keep remembering that manufacturing has shifted very unevenly, but to the global South, that if you look at living standards measured by standard economics, the global South has grown faster than the global West. That doesn't mean that there's not exploitation taking place. So we just have to somehow integrate that into our analysis. What you said about the military, you're absolutely right about the military. What I meant was that people who looked at this economically said this was macro stimulus, and I don't think that was the key. But the main thing about the military is what you said, it's geopolitical. Absolutely agree. So a few things, and I'll get to my China thing, which I've been delaying. I don't see a bipolar world when the US has 300 bases off of China, and Canada has more foreign bases than China does. And China has no bases on this continent. There's some, it's talking about this in bipolar terms sounds a little bit like liberal pluralism to me. There's differences, but boy, there's no comparison here in terms of this kinds of military extension and capacity. China is the most integrated, when we talk about China having a historical history of independence from colonialism, that's the point, that the making of global capitalism was challenging that historical fact. And China became the most integrated country that has ever existed into capitalism. Nobody has ever been as integrated into capitalism in terms of its dependence for exports, its access to foreign technology, which is trying to build some independence on, but it's been, the foreign investments coming in were always welcome because they were getting with it foreign technologies. China is integrated. So when we get, maybe I'll mention the BRICS in a second. Oh, let me say something quickly, and then I'll try to get to China. The BRICS are not anything, this isn't even comparable to Bandung. These aren't a coherent group of 4 countries that are going to challenge things. South Africa is a mess internally, completely, full of corruption and everything else. Brazil, as you said, who knows where Brazil's going? But I remember during the last set of trade negotiations, India and Brazil sounded very militant about free trade. But what they weren't doing is challenging free trade. They were operating within the system. Lula was asking the Americans to open up the border for exports of sugar. He wasn't saying we want to feed our own people and we want to take on our own corporations so we can feed our own people. He was actually speaking on behalf of the multinational corporations in Brazil, the food corporations, so that the market would be opened up. And we have to watch for this. What are they actually asking? And that's what, let me get to that with China. Okay. China has contradictions that we just can't project on a straight line. If China keeps growing, they're going to be number one. One is the fact that they're so integrated, and that integration hasn't ended. It's slowed down, but that integration is still there. If you look at China's exports, the exports to Russia are nothing almost. The export, it's the United States, it's South Korea, which is in the American camp and integrated, and it's Japan. Those are their 3 main exports. And then you throw on Europe. I mean, this is what China depends on for its exports. If it was going to change this, you'd have to have a whole internal structure. There'd be a struggle between the capitalists in China, between those who want to keep exporting and are integrated into global capitalism, and those inland who are thinking about developing for internal consumption. So China in the process is actually developing a capitalist class that we have to take into consideration. Some of this is the sons and daughters of the Communist Party members, but what is this going to mean if China wants to become more autonomous and inward looking? What is it doing with the working class? China has, done quite amazing things in terms of raising living standards and raising poverty, but workers can fight for their wages in a particular factory, but if they try to make links across workplaces, they're generally jailed. So there's the question of what kind of a working class is it forming, and where will that working class stand in these struggles? I would read China as what they're saying is, look, we're now a major player globally. We want to be respected as that. We want some status, and America isn't giving us that. We don't want arbitrary American intervention. In fact, they're asking America to act like a responsible empire. That's what they were really saying to Trump. You're just arbitrarily changing the rules that you keep insisting on. What America wants, it's pretty ambiguous. They're worried about China militarily, but they still want to go there. They still want to get their finance in. They want their high tech to be there. So, this is a critical part. And China doesn't have the capacity to act like a global hegemon. They can't do that. That's not where, you can't do that if most of the wealth in the country is in Europe and Japan and South Korea or Taiwan even. China doesn't have the capacity. It doesn't want the burden of having to worry about how you run this complex empire. It's making these small adjustments, in terms of international exchange. US is roughly 60%. Europe's got 20%. China isn't even any close to Europe. And Europe got there. The fact that it has the euro doesn't challenge the dollar, it supplements it. It's part of the dollarization of the euro. And the renminbi doesn't play much more of a role than the Canadian dollar changes. So China is trying to establish a place within an empire that America oversees, and China is trying to establish some autonomy within it. Now that leads to tensions, but this is not about trying to replace the US. And I think we have to understand that. It doesn't have the capacity, and it doesn't have the interest in doing it. It doesn't have, that kind of, the military bases around the world, but and the biggest thing it doesn't have is if you want to replace the US, you have to replace it with the renminbi. And although you can exchange it with telling Brazil, we'll accept your currency and you'll accept ours, if you want the renminbi to play a role, you have to liberalize it. Capital has to know that if we invest in China, we can take our money out. China's not going to set up and China won't let that happen because their control over the Chinese economy depends very much on not being liberal about finance. That's a critical part of their whole strategy. So there's a structural reason for China not to do this. So I think how we have to see China, and even more so everything else that you've raised, I should say something about Russia before I leave, is that China is trying to change its status within the American empire at a moment when it's got some friends, it can do some things. There's a lot of talk in Africa about different currencies, etc. That doesn't mean a lot in terms of the kind of radical changes we're talking about. The question is whether China, in trying to assert a degree of independence, is leading to the US to react in a way that pushes China to have to move even further away, which would be a massive thing for China to do, given its integration. What the US is doing is, it's not that the US hegemony is being challenged. What's being challenged is American absolute power. And that's what America can't get out of their head. We have to have absolute power. That's the story with Russia. That's the story with China. And that's why it's so hard to come to some kind of an agreement. But they don't actually need it. There's a lot, they don't need absolute power, but that's what happens when you have power. Very quickly on Russia, which I think we'd really disagree with. When there was the Soviet Union, they couldn't compete with the West. When they actually were at their peak, they couldn't compete with the West. What we're seeing is a desperate Russia who's defensively saying, we're completely surrounded by NATO, And here's our, if Ukraine surrounds it too, we're completely encircled. This is our last chance to do something. After this, we won't have anything. They're a midget in terms of the economies of Europe. They don't have any ambitions to restore an empire. Right? I mean, Putin had this great statement, which he said, anybody who doesn't want to see the restoration of the Russian Empire doesn't have a heart, but anybody who thinks it's possible doesn't have a brain. And I take him seriously on that. Russia doesn't have the capacity to say, they don't even have the capacity to take over Ukraine. They just want to, they want pieces of the territory. So Russia's not a threat. And the United States, again, I think what the United States is thinking is, and I think these are praising the United States, these are the neocons, is if Russia and Germany got together, they would have a bit more autonomy. Not that they would replace us, and they don't want that. At the same time, if Russia and China get together, they will have a bit more autonomy. So Russia's kind of a linchpin, and they're looking to weaken it. And whether the strategy was a smart strategy or not, we'll see, or whether there's pushback. But I just wouldn't make too much of the kind of pushback that's coming out from people in Africa saying we're neutral on the war. China's been actually quite cautious in terms of sending arms. To their credit, they've been, they've expressed the autonomy of at least being neutral and trying to play a role for peace. But we're not seeing, unless the tensions rise up, and people can, and when tensions exist, act stupidly, we're not seeing a radical change in global capitalism yet. And I think the only way we'll see it is when there's actually people from below who are fighting to get out of it with a different kind of a system. And we don't see that. We don't see that in the West. We're not seeing it in the South. Okay. And then we can do our final 5 minutes.
Our final,
Fantastic.
final 5.
Justin, do you want to take your final 5?
Yes. Okay. So let me just say that I think I want to disambiguate here, or like make sure we understand. I do not think that China wants to or has any interest in replacing the US, nor does Russia. I don't think the Soviet Union wanted to. I don't think China wants to. I don't think that's on the horizon. That's a big part of why they, in their own words, talk about multipolarity. They don't want to replace the US. Nobody wants to replace the US. What's going to replace the US is something like what the United Nations was supposed to be, a system of sovereign states that can set their own national economic policies. That's what China says they want. And, again, we can debate whether they do it or not, or the extent to which they do it, but I do think that is what they practice, more so definitely than the US and the West projections aside. So China doesn't have bases. I don't think they want bases. All of that is true. Let me just again, the voluntary cover that capitalism puts over. I have a disagreement with you, Sam, in that, like, the way you talk about capitalism, I find it's like it's a person. It's like capitalism does this, it says this, but I don't really think of it that way. But to try to use your language to answer this, like it's not. I don't believe that any of the imposition of the U.S. imperialists' economic policies came from a voluntary debate. That's a huge statement I just made, but I don't think I'll repeat it. I don't think any of it was a voluntary adoption by elites in the global South. I believe all of it was violence. It was coups. It was assassinations. It was the CIA. Bill Bloom's Killing Hope. All of Chomsky's stuff. The book on Indonesia, the Jakarta Method. They committed genocide in Indonesia to stop, the socialists. The coups in Chile, the Southern Cone dictatorships, the dictatorship in Brazil, the bases in South Korea, like it's just Zaire, Zaire had the IMF came and took over their bank. IMF officials came and hung out in their central bank and took it over. Like, this was not a debate that the capitalists won. This was a blood-soaked neo-colonial campaign of mass murder and death in the West too, right? We know about the West and Operation Gladio and the Stay Behind armies and all of those conspiracies as well. Now, the global south, there's two other little factual things, maybe three, that I want to dispute. One is, you said, the US had 50% of manufacturing after the war and it went down, and that's not decline. It had 50% of manufacturing after the war because all of its European rivals had self-destructed, right? So I think that, the lower, and the same thing with the global south growing faster. The global south grew faster than the West because it started lower. It started lower because of all the hundreds of years of colonial drain. The China being the most integrated with capitalism, I don't agree. I think Haiti, I think the DR Congo, I think that Afghanistan, these are the most integrated countries. These are the countries that don't have any say in monetary policy, economic policy, union law, economics. They don't have any say. All of those things are imposed on them by the West, sometimes, like I said, literally by personnel who come and take over the governments. China has independence in those areas. China subordinates its billionaires. If China doesn't like what a billionaire is doing, it's the billionaire that goes to jail. You talked about workers that go to jail, but China doesn't have any problem sending billionaires to jail if the billionaires step out of line. It cancels their, cancels their moves that they make. They behave towards billionaires in ways that are absolutely appalling to Americans, because Americans understand that billionaires are supposed to be in charge of everything and worshipped and revered. So I do, again, we have a disagreement. We have a very serious disagreement about China and what China is and what China's doing and what kind of country China is. And a lot of what you're saying about China is like, China doesn't want this and China wants that and America wants this. And to me, that all sounds like, again, like the way you've been talking about capitalism. You're kind of like assigning an anthropomorphic character to China, whereas, we have to analyze what like individual actors or collective actors within China are doing, and we can't really say much about what they want in that sense. I agree with your dismissal of Brazil and South Africa in terms of BRICS, but I don't think that extends to Russia and China. So finally, to the point about the yuan not replacing the dollar, that's fine, but that's not the only option, and that's not, again, what even Dilma and the BRICS Bank and Glaziev in Russia and the Chinese are talking about right now. They're talking about things like how you can have a currency, or how you can have an international financial system without the dollar and without one currency doing it all, which is like what, for example, Keynes proposed at the Bretton Woods, which was shot down by the Americans who wanted the dollar system, the Bancor, the idea of a currency that isn't in what people's wallets or people's bank accounts, but it's used just to clear international transactions and restore balances between countries instead of weaponizing them, which is what the US can do. So that is that's my final statement, which means you have the last word, Sam.
Go
I guess I had
Sam.
the first word. So.
And after we're off the air, I'm going to keep talking. I've got two or three kind of conclusions,
Okay.
and I can't avoid though saying some of the things that you're raising about China. I mean, your defense of the billionaires. Wow. I mean, the question is, how did China end up with so many billionaires is a question. It says something about the Chinese system. The fact that they jailed a couple of billionaires, that's the way you justify what you're actually doing. They left most of the billionaires in place because the billionaires come out of an economic system that is capitalist, that the state is, it's supporting markets and certain kinds of inequalities as necessary. Your point about, the horrors of the development of capitalism, well, of course. By the way, I should say that I don't see it as, obviously people make history, and they make it given the circumstances that they confront, which are certain structures. So there are structures that are impersonal, and there are actors who act through them. But what they can do depends on those structures. So if you look at the history of capitalism domestically, of course, it's full of bloodshed right from the beginning in England. And it's full of that in the global South. But I don't think you can understand the global South if you only understand it in involuntary ways, in the same way that you can't understand what happens under capitalism if you simply say bosses exploit workers. There's also a reaction of workers of trying to make it within the system or justify it within the system or deal with with what they've been, the hand that they've been held. And that has to do with not debt being formed on the global south, but people looking to debt to solve problems, looking to export because they see that as a way of getting income and getting jobs and developing industry. And that has to be part of the story. It's a very uneven story, but that capitalism just becomes this plunderer. And capitalism is more than that. That's why it survived, because it's more than a plunderer. Okay, some more important points that I think I want to make. I want to make the point that a lot of people who look to inter-imperial rivalry, and I don't think you are in this case, but it's relevant here, look to it as a way of saying, if there's rivalry, the US won't be as dominant and that'll be better. The problem with that argument is that you can actually have rivalry that is worse, that leads to nationalism in a reactionary sense, of the kind that Trump was promoting, that even in the global south can lead to a certain kind of nationalism that is about people sacrificing for their elites in order to fit in differently. I mean, those are things to consider when we're talking about the question of rivalry and bipolarity. There's also the question of, if there's a crisis that we're cheering for a lot of workers and people in the global south, the response to that will be to get rid of the crisis. It lowers expectations, so people look at the period before the crisis as looking better. Crises do not necessarily politicize people, which is part of what I want to get at. The main thing I want to say about your rebuttal, and then I'll conclude with two other points, is that there's all kinds of people including liberals here, who are talking about, why don't we have a more rational system where people, we don't have the dollar, we have a common currency. Well, that's a socially, what that's about isn't a bunch of people meeting in a room and saying, I have a better idea. This is about struggle. This is about power. This is about capacities. It isn't going to happen because somebody decided we'll have a new IMF currency, which has been floated forever. It doesn't happen for particular reasons, in the same way that after the war, the US won its way because it had the material capacities. And by the way, the loss of the manufacturing was looking more into the 50s, when the point was that through the American system, Europe actually shared in it. That was part of the making of the system and making it work. And that's also been part of, the countries were poor for historical reasons related to colonialism, but the question was, is development of any kind being blocked, which was what a lot of the left was saying. And the fact was, it wasn't. It was blocked some places and it wasn't others. And we have to deal with those differences within them. I guess my main argument is that to talk about changes in terms of bipolarity or multipolarity mean radical changes in the nature of power in the global economy. And that's not there. Kautsky, after the First World War, raised the question of, why don't we all get together and stop having a war amongst elites? Well, that doesn't happen because capitalism develops so unevenly that different capitalists are always going to think of, I'll have an advantage if I do something different. That's what the US solved. It actually said, we're overseeing this, and these are the rules, and you're going to follow them, and you're going to benefit from them. And we're going to have this military to kind of police things. It doesn't work that way. So these notions of, unless we link these notions of a new currency that looks more rational to some kind of radical social changes, it isn't going to happen. You're playing on the margins. And those kinds of changes won't happen unless we start debating more what's happening inside each of these countries, the contradictions inside of them and the class struggles inside of them. Because I think what your argument is skipping over by looking at the US as the driver of everything that's bad, which I think it's very prominent and obviously, but that there are class forces domestically that we have to address. And those are contradictory, including, the extent to which the working class is integrated or not. I do think that you're seriously underestimating China's integration. I mean, China's integration is phenomenal. Yeah, Afghanistan is dependent, yes, but China voluntarily. This wasn't the US taking over China and telling them you're going to enter global capitalism. This was the US conceding, we'll support you in terms of the WTO because we want you in, because we're looking at your market. You know, I was in negotiations with GM once, and they told me that the middle class in China potentially had a larger market than all of Europe put together. And that was his way of telling us, you better behave because we're going to move to China. Now, the point is that China is profoundly integrated in class terms, and even, you know, and in terms of party legitimacy. Their legitimacy comes very much from showing people that they can deliver in the goods. Now, the question is, how do they break from this? Do they want to break with this? And this is a major question. This isn't a question of somebody saying, let's have a different currency. I got a great idea. It's not going to happen that way. We have to really take this seriously. I guess that I'll conclude there. I'm really bugged by us trying to solve internal problems by thinking that rivalry between big powers will do the heavy weighting for us, heavy lifting for us. I do think they're relevant. I mean, I think what happens in China is very important. If the Chinese working class said we want socialism again, that would be profound. Now that would be, then I would be interested in talking about polarity and where it's going. As it is, I'm watching, and I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen militarily. Yeah, you know, we're kind of observing this. I'm just skeptical that something is already in the process of happening because we see these particular signs that I don't think are that major yet. They're significant. I mean, I do think that China has changed the way global capitalism works. And I think it's one of the things I'd really study more if I was studying this again. Okay.
Wow. Well, I need a glass of water. Sam and Justin, I think you're both winners, despite the fact that we all lose under capitalism, of course. And folks listening or watching this, hopefully through this journey, you all learned something, wrestled dialectically, and of course, non-liberally with the tension inside this debate, and most importantly, made friends along the way. You can go to Twitter and vote in the poll. If you're watching on YouTube, you can indicate who you think won in the comments. If you're listening on one of the podcast apps, you can write a review, which also helps, and indicate who you think won in the debate in that review. And may capitalism and all Western colonial empires fall. And may you all have a good rest of your day.
Sam wants to say something else.
Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that as much as I think Justin and I are really looking at this from a different lens, and it's the lens that's got to be debated, but I've always felt camaraderie with Justin about where we want to go.
Yeah.
And his clarity of thought.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
I thank you both for teaching me so much.
Once again,
we're
all winners.
We're all winners.
Okay.
But Sam, if I get outvoted, I know you mentioned as we were planning this that if you lose, you have to come back for a grudge match or like a rematch. But I think if you win, I'll have to call either Radhika Desai or Carl Za or someone like a bigger multipolar boss for you, because it'll be like a video game where like you have
Mortal
to face
Kombat.
the next.
I'm gonna bring my heavyweights in too.
Ooh, I'd love to see
We should
that.
have a panel.
Just kind of relax and watch.
Yeah, we can relax, right? We would be like the first.
Yeah, but I do think these are the kind of big debates in terms of what's the framework that people have to kind of get their heads into, especially now. They didn't seem relevant for a long time.
Yeah.
But now these debates seem more relevant again. And I think that's good. And I hope that
it's because there's a transition happening. Oh no, wait, no.
Well,
Justin.
there are changes happening. I agree. There are changes happening. But, yeah, no, what they mean. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway,
I'll
good.
stop recording here.
Thanks for setting this up. Great.